Okay. Ready? Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the second of the Barbara and David Zalaznick virtual reading series entitled At Home. Let me begin by expressing my immense gratitude to Barbara and David Zalaznick. It is their generosity which makes it possible for us to have this event tonight, a talk and a reading by the inimitable M. Evelina Galang. Very excited about that. My name is Aishan Hutchinson. I direct the creative writing program here at Cornell. My role tonight, though, is that of interlocutor. As following Evelina's talk and reading, we will have a conversation, one in which you can participate by submitting questions throughout the event in the chat feature below. I hope you do. Please submit all your questions in the chat and we'll try to answer as much of them as possible. This event is being recorded and the recording will be available to view at the same URL. It is now my pleasure to introduce my dear friend, M. Evelina Galang. Evelina is the author of 3 marvelous books of fiction, 1 book of nonfiction, and the editor of an anthology. Evelina's work extends radically and beautifully language written, as the poet Caroline Forche once said, in the aftermath of extremity. One of these extremities Evelina's work confronts is the harrowing stories of Filipino women and girls kidnapped during World War II by Imperial Japanese soldiers and forced to become comfort women. In bearing witness to the narratives of these women, Evelina creates not only a subversive choral of survival, but creates also a new archive of intervention and accuracy. Indeed, Evelina's talk tonight, which draws on her forthcoming novel, is called Truth or Dare, grounding beautiful sorrow, beautiful sky in historical accuracy. Evelina's work has won great critical praise and numerous awards, including the 2004 Association of Writers and Writing Programs Prize for the novel, the 2007 Global Filipino Literary Award, the 2004 Gustavus Myers Outstanding Book Awards Advancing Human Rights, and a 2002 Senior Research Fellowship from Fulbright. She directs the MFA Creative Writing Program at the University of Miami and is core faculty and board of Voices of Our Nation's Arts Foundation, VONA. Last spring, in the early before times, Evelina was the Zalaznick Distinguished Visiting Writer at Cornell. Her visit was to have ended in the late spring with a public reading on campus, but the after times came and plans had to change. Seeing you now, Evelina, in this format, I think of it as a kind of defiance of time. And I am grateful that you can join us from Miami. And so this is not a welcome, but a welcome back.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Aishan. I want to thank you. I want to thank Helena Viramontes and everyone there at Cornell in the English department. I want to thank my graduate students that I worked with while I was there last winter, and also the undergrads that I had in the advanced writing workshop. It was such a pleasure to be with all of you in like partly the before times and partly the after times, and to really get the opportunity to work on this book, Beautiful Sorrow, Beautiful Sky. I've been researching it for a number of years, and finally I had the time and the place to sit down and write the first draft in its entirety. I also want to thank Philip Lewis and Catherine Porter, who I think are out there listening. They are academics with you there at Cornell, or have been, and they were my landlords while I was in Ithaca. So thank you so much for the beautiful space to write this work. Tonight, I'm going to be talking to you about that research and how it all came together for this novel. I once had a teacher say that fiction is a fine blend of memory and the imagination. But as I continue to explore the lives of characters rooted in the experience of my ancestors, my community, and to specific moments in time, I see the importance of getting not only the facts right, but the context, the atmosphere, the perspective. I revised my teacher's definition, and I want to say that fine fiction then is a fluid blend of memory, imagination, and historical accuracy. Beautiful Sorrow, Beautiful Sky is a septuagenarian love story. When Dolores Angara's husband dies of a heart attack, she moves from a rural town in Quezon province in the Philippines to the imaginary city of San Cristo, California. And I have located that imaginary town just miles from the San Francisco Bay Area. There, she settles with her children she and her husband sent to the United States to study and become nurses and doctors. All her life, Dolores has kept her sorrow to herself. That during World War II, she was one of the Filipina comfort women taken hostage by the Imperial Japanese Army. Dolores believes that she can bury this secret once her husband has passed away and leave it there in the Philippines. But when she meets retired postman Kenny Amano at a community center and he vows to court her, the stories of her past begin to rise out into the open. And just as he is winning her affection, she learns that Kenny too is a survivor of World War II. Though she thinks she's been thinking that he's Filipino and American, so, just acting like an American, but Filipino. He's actually Japanese American, and he too survived World War II, but only here in the United States as a survivor of the internment camps. This is the story of how each has been imprisoned and abused physically, emotionally, and mentally by war, and how each has learned to survive despite a tortured past. The book is about what it means to consider love in the twilight of their lives, or, as I like to say, does he get the girl? The novel builds on my existing body of work and research. In the novel Angel de la Luna and the Fifth Glorious Mystery, the plight of World War II comfort women and their struggle for justice creates the backdrop for 15-year-old Angel de la Luna and her coming of age. And in the creative nonfiction work, Lola's House, Filipino Women Living with War, I document the testimonies of 15 surviving Filipina comfort women of World War II. My experiences with those 15 Lolas, which is Tagalog for grandmothers, has changed the way I understand the world. And their testimonies underline the notion that every war is a war on women. Following the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, wartime hysteria swept the American public, leading President Roosevelt to sign Executive Order 9066, condemning more than 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent to internment for the duration of the war. My interest has been to discover through the personal and interior lives of these specific characters the political implications of the brutal relationships between nations, and then the power of intimacy to override history, personal and international, for the sake of companionship, forgiveness, and love. So Beautiful Sorrow, Beautiful Sky is in progress. It's in its second draft. So everything I say about it tonight is subject to change. I completed the first draft of the book this spring when I was here at Cornell as your Zelaznik Distinguished Visiting Writer. And the first draft is, I brought part of it, and then I was able to finish, like at the very end of May, 14 415 pages. First draft is what I call expression. I write that draft to find out what the story is about. And then the second and third and fourth drafts I call my path to art. It is the place where I make strategic and artistic choices, and I open myself up to fully re-see and revise the work. Before I get there, I need to know the world the characters are living in. I need to understand the climate, political, cultural, historical, and generational, in order to accurately build the story. In 2013, I traveled over 2,000 miles in the American West, visiting former United States Japanese internment camps. I drove from Tule Lake, California, to Minidoka, Idaho, to Manzanar, California, and then finished my excursion tour in Los Angeles. At the camps, now memorialized as United States national monuments and historical sites, I was able to walk the grounds, examine former barracks, and read the testimonies of Japanese American internment camp survivors. The primary research of observing space, location, weather, and artifacts helped to give me a visceral sense of what weather and domestic conditions might have been like during the various seasons of the year. The testimonies and other historical texts confirm some of my intuitive inklings of attitudes of those held in the camps, especially the children. Then in Los Angeles, I explored the Japanese American National Museum's exhibition, Common Ground, the Heart of the Community, which incorporates hundreds of objects, documents, and photographs collected by the National Museum. The installation chronicles 130 years of Japanese American history, beginning with the early days of the Issei pioneers through the World War II incarceration and into the present. Then, the following summer, in 2014, I traveled to the Philippines in search of the house and the neighborhood that my female protagonist, Dolores Angara, would live just prior to World War II. Her husband, Andres Angara, comes from a well-to-do family, so it had to be a house that carried some kind of opulence with it for the time and the period. While I was in Manila, I visited the Lagarda House, located in Metro Manila's subdivision of Malacañang. The Lagarda Mansion, built by Doña Filomena Rosas Lagarda in 1937, was among the very first Art Deco houses in Metro Manila. I was able to tour the home and talk with granddaughter Suzette Montignola, who, in addition to restoring the house as it was, also saved all her grandmother's recipes. And at the time that we were there, she had a fine dining establishment on the grounds, and it was called La Cocina de Tita Moning. So I really got a chance to inhabit that house and imagine what the lives were like that were living there in the time of Dolores pre-World War II. Another highlight of my research was the interview and walking tour with the late historian and artist Carlos Celdran through the streets of Intramuros, World War II's famous open city. I have been reading like crazy. There's a picture of all my books here. I just threw them down on the ground so I could take a picture. Every book I could get a hold of, literary fiction, nonfiction, historical documentation, anything that has to do with the period of World War II in both the United States and in the Philippines. And then literature of Japanese American internment, works like John Okada's Nono Boy, Julie Otsuka's When the Emperor Was Divine, and Jean Osishi's Fox Drum Bebop are among the fine literature I read. And then there was this classic graphic memoir, Citizen 13660 by Mina Okubo, which ultimately became a very important text for me because it had such vivid images of her experiences there in the camps. One of my most prized resources has been the Densho Digital Archives, a nonprofit organization dedicated to documenting the oral testimonies of incarcerated Japanese Americans. I have listened to numerous testimonies from former internees, contemporaries of my character, Kenny Amado, and these interviews work in tandem with the more than 40 hours of interviews I conducted with the Filipino comfort women during my Fulbright and subsequent summer grants from the University of Miami, visiting the Philippines and the Lolas. Not only was I able to glean information from these interviews and testimonies, but I'm also really able to observe the posture, attitude, and the voices of those who shared similar experiences to my characters' backstories. For me, the interesting part of writing Beautiful Sorrow, Beautiful Sky comes from an obsession I have with Dolores, Andres, and Kenny. I have fallen in love with these characters. I want to know what makes them tick, what pains them, not only what trauma has done to them, but how they have been able to work through it. And for this, I needed context. These characters not only come from a time when the political climate was different than my own, but also the cultural, gender, and generational attitudes were different than mine, and in some cases different from the periphery characters in the novel. So for me, the primary reason I need to get the history, the time and place and cultural attitudes right is for the sake of my characters, number one. The secondary reason is to be true to that history and to the people who would have lived in that time and space. While I don't think it's my duty as a fiction writer to teach history or to represent a people or promote a certain kind of politics, I do think it's my duty to tell a good story and to set it in a specific time and place. And for that reason, it's important to be historically accurate. So what I've done is to kind of create a montage of some of the images from my research that I've done. I talked a little bit about going to the Philippines, and I also talked about my trips to the internment camps in the summer of 2013. And so if you guys wouldn't mind, could you play that video? It's also got music that's really important to the novel itself. In the Filipino images that you will see, there's a love song playing underneath, and it's a really important song for Dolores and her husband and their love story. And then in the images of the internment camps, that song is also a very important song to Kenny Amano and his grandmother. So go ahead and play it, and you can see how I was starting to gather all these images together for the novel.
Sa gabing madilim, wangis mo'y bituin sa langit, o tanglaw sa gabing tahimik, larawan mo nagbigay pasakit. Oy,
gising at magbangon sa pagkagupiling, sa pagkakatulong, na lubhang mahimbing. Buksan ang bintana at ako'y dungawin, ngang mapagtanto mo ang tunay kong pagdaing. O ilaw sa gabing malamig, wangis mo'y bituin sa langit, o tanglaw sa gabing tahimik, larawan mo neneng nagbigay pasakit.
magising at magbangon sa pagkagupiling sa pagkakatulong na lubhang mahimbing buksan ang bintana at ako'y dungawin nang mapagtanto mo ang tunay kong pagdaing.
Don't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. No, no, no. Don't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me till I come marching home. Don't go walking down Lover's Lane with anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. No, no, no. Don't go walking down Lover's Lane with anyone else but me till I come marching home. I just got word from a guy who heard from the guy next door to me. The girl he met just loves to pet, and it fits you to a T. So don't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me till I come marching home.
Don't give out with those lips of yours to anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. No, no, no. Watch the girls on the foreign shores. You'll have to report to me when you come marching home. Don't hold anyone on your knee. You better be true to me. You better be true to me. You better be true to me. Don't hold anyone on your knee. You're getting a third degree when you come marching home. You're on your own where there is no phone, and I can't keep tab on you. Be fair to me, I'll guarantee this is one thing that I'll do. I won't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but you till you come marching home.
Don't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me. I know the apple tree is reserved for you and me, and I'll be true till you come marching home.
So that was just a short collage of some of the images I witnessed and the spaces I walked through in trying to understand the characters' lives that I'm creating. And I just wanted to give you a short excerpt from the book in progress. And this is from Dolores' perspective. One Sunday, soon after the war, Dolores agreed to go Pashal. Andres took them to the top of a ridge where they overlooked the lake. From here, she saw cattail fronds blowing in the mountain breeze. She laid out the meal, a basket of fried fish, steamed rice, and ripe tomatoes, pulled out glass bottles with fresh calamansi juice. Meanwhile, Andres shadowed Soledad as she tottered around on her fat legs, her arms reaching out as if to grab the tall grass around her. He's a good father, Delore thought. And the baby? The baby. It was hard for her to imagine giving birth to this child, what she must have been like right out of the womb, how once she was even smaller than this toddler. Do you remember? He asked her now. Giving birth? She asked, pulling plates from the basket. No, she said, not really. I meant, you know. Oh, that. She closed her eyes, tried to think of that time when they were apart, to remember the feel of wet mud covering her body, the blanket of banana leaves keeping her hidden from the sun, but all she saw were his words. All that came to her was a picture of the story he had painted. I was alone, she asked him. He nodded. And we were just outside the city. The baby tripped into Delore's arms, kissed her with an open mouth, there on her cheek. She wiped the saliva away. Yes. It was morning? She handed the baby back to him. It was. My araw? Yes, not a cloud in the sky. Oo nga nga, she said. That's what you told me. I remember that. You do? You remember? I remember that you told me. She wondered what she would have done if the roles were reversed. If he had been lost during the war, would she have searched for him or given up? Would she have scooped him out of some ditch near Pampanga, or would she have walked right by him? Maybe she would have just kept walking. If she was on that road and he was whimpering below the brush, she would have heard the wind or the birds or roosters crowing. She would have dismissed the very idea of him, moved on. She saw the disappointment on his face, and she felt a little guilty for not remembering. But then she reminded him, Nawala ako sa sarili ko. How do you expect me to remember? Right, Mahal, he said. Mahirap yan. But the thing was, she did remember. At night, when they were in bed, and after she drifted off to sleep, she saw the clouds shifting from behind the fronds. She smelled the wet mud, practically tasted it. In her sleep, she'd stick her 2 fingers into her ear to clear the dirt from them. She conjured up the war in bits and pieces. She didn't see the fighting as much as she felt the pain of it in her bones and aching in her arms and legs. She smelled burning flesh. She imagined sores on her belly and just below. She felt like something was slicing her in two. Sometimes the war seemed so real she would jolt right out of bed and find herself being rocked by him, his thick arms holding her down to keep her from flying off the bed. Just a dream, he would say to her. Just a dream. Gising ka na, mahal. Gising ka na. For a long time after the war, she would look at Andres and the way he smiled at her and brought her meals, the way he held her hand, and she would say to herself, this man really loves me. Who is he? Everyone told her, especially her mother-in-law. He is your asawa, hija, your childhood sweetheart. Mahal mo. Paano ba yan, she'd think. If he is my husband, then why does he seem like such a stranger to me? At night, when he was fast asleep, she'd examine his face from her side of the bed, the slope of his nose and the way his jaw was set so tight, like he was ready for a fight. He had long, dark lashes, and his wavy hair was always swept up and away from his forehead. She thought he was handsome and kind, but she didn't know him. And if they were husband and wife, then where was their house? Why were they staying in his mother's house? The whole family nursed her back, feeding her little spoonfuls of her life, asking her to listen, just listen, and maybe something would come back to her. She didn't think they were lying, and she was falling in love with each of them, even as she wondered who they really were. He was so patient with her and didn't seem to mind when she refused him sex. Sleeping was the worst. The dreams came fragmented and confusing. When she slept, she relinquished control over what her mind would do. She did not remember. The stories that her family gave her never grew back into memories, but other images, like little pieces of shrapnel, began to emerge in her sleep. Sometimes it was the bright lights of a bomb and the thunder that came with it. Sometimes it was the image of a bayonet slicing through the air. She woke up one night clutching her chest and ripping open her nightgown. She found a scar the size of a cigarillo branded in between her two small breasts. Another time she woke and she felt the swelling between her legs, but there was nothing there. She couldn't understand why Andres loved her, why he searched through several barrios and little farms to find her. Try to love him, she told herself. Try. In those first few months, he was so patient with her, and she could do anything at all, and he would respond with only words, kind words, or a touch. Sometimes she tried to be mean just to see what he would do, to see if that would send him to another room, but it never did. And soon she found herself gazing at him when he was unaware. The house had servants, but he insisted on serving her meals and bathing her. He insisted on combing her hair. He sang to her when he did these things, or he'd tell her stories of their childhood. He told her she used to chase after him, but she only smiled when he said this. She could not imagine it, she'd answer, and he would confess that it was he who had pursued her. One night, as he was preparing her bath, she told him, Andres, I can bathe myself. I am not an invalid. Are you sure, Mahal? You're still weak. You can't even stand up by yourself. This was true. It seemed that whatever happened during the war had stripped her of all the strength. She made an attempt to rise from the chair where she watched him filling a basin full of water. She pushed on the chair and tried to carry her weight, but her arms felt faint and her skin dampened from perspiration. He had stopped what he was doing, and he watched her from afar, with two arms ready should she fall. After the third attempt, she shook her head, and when she saw him waiting like that, her heart filled up with such a warmth that even in her desire to be free of him, she said, Sige na nga, come get me. So, Aishan, you want to come join me?
Yes. Thank you for that, Evelina. That was just marvelous. What a rich offering to hear about the research informing the book, and then to hear some of the a passage from the book and that kind of textual richness that you're able to weave by, and I could hear the echoes of the research going in there. And in fact, I just want to begin by asking about that process of research, whether or not, how intimidating was it? And you did say ways in which the research towards a kind of historical accuracy is absolutely necessary, right, particularly for writing these stories where they're competing powers of histories happening. So the need for accuracy is absolutely necessary. But I wonder how intimidating was that process itself of research?
Well, I have to say, I was so curious about the subject matter that rather than being intimidated, I couldn't get enough of it. You know, I really felt like I wanted to know everything. And it really started when I began my own research for Lola's House, Filipino Women Living with War, and I was really lucky. They say that, historians say there were 1,000 women in the Philippines who were taken and put into military sex slave camps by the Japanese army. And I had the pleasure of meeting 40 of them and then really getting to know 16 of their stories. And in hearing them and meeting them, I had such a hunger for understanding what went on during that time. Their generation is the same generation as my own parents' generation, my mom and my dad. So there was, for me, a kind of personal attachment to finding out what happened, to the women and to that period. And also there was a hunger for me as a person who lives in the United States, who's American born, but is of Filipino descent, such a hunger to connect with the history of my parents' birthplace. So that's where it began. And then as the years went on, and I started that research and that history for those projects, the prior projects, back in the late 90s. And as I became more involved with that research, with the women, and it was really primary research. That's where I began.
Yeah.
And I the curiosity kept on going, and I worked a lot with some activists here in the United States, including Congressman Mike Honda when he was in Congress from California, who is Japanese American, who was also interned as a boy in the camps. So there was, for me, a great desire to just like dig in and find all the information I could find, if that makes any sense. So not intimidating as much as just hungry, you know?
Hungry.
Yeah.
Okay, which part of it was intimidating? the writing? Because I'm thinking about as you've described, the process of moving from research to writing, and those 3 steps you described there is just so marvelous. And you have been doing this work, as you said, since the 90s. So it's been a long time, sort of brewing. And the Lola book is nonfiction.
Right.
Have you used the stories you have researched in fiction before?
I think, well, you know, yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, anytime I'm working on a story, you know, and even if it's not necessarily this particular subject matter, I find myself doing, you know, reading up on, if it's not in an area that I'm completely aware of,
Yeah.
if it's at a time, I mean, like even in this book, there's a lot of baseball going on in this book. There's a lot of baseball going on, which I am not, my family, my husband and his side of the family, and I think even my side of the family, everybody's a baseball fan, but I always found it, you know, not that big a deal. But all of a sudden, in this particular story, baseball, so I found myself really doing a lot of research, you know. So I think, and I don't know if I'm answering the question, but I think that, you know, all fiction for me has required either having firsthand knowledge of kind of the characters that I'm looking at, or the culture, my own culture of being Filipino American, you know, and having just an intuitive and an integral understanding of things and observations. And of course, there is no like one culture, one community, right? We're incredibly diverse within our own cultures. So, but when you're a part of that community and you're, you know, you're bumping heads and supporting one another and everything, that there's a way that you start, you know, you observe, and then all of that becomes part of the research. Like living is part of the research.
Okay.
Being observant is part of the research, right? So there is nothing that we write, that I write, I can't say for anyone else, that I write that is completely from memory or completely from imagination. There's a little bit of everything going on at once. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And from hearing just that passage you read, the synthesis is marvelous, of bringing together the imaginative and the observant, whether directly or through research. There are lots of questions coming in, and I want to mix a few of them in with my own. So Laurie Fisher asks, the montage and music are beautiful. Did you take the photos? I asked because I'm wondering if you saw the connection while you were there or after you returned.
It's beautiful. I took the photos, except for the ones that I'm in. But yeah, I'm the one that took the photos. And in terms of the connection, what's been really beautiful about this process that I've been engaged in is that there's this gathering of the material, and then sitting with it, and then dreaming, you know, creating my own, like just kind of sitting with it. And that's what I really loved about my time in Ithaca when I was sitting, the apartment I was in was above the Moosewood Cafe. And just the days were dedicated, especially because we were on lockdown, the days were really dedicated to just sitting with the material and dreaming and thinking about these characters and imagining them in different scenarios and imagining how they would interact with one another, and really dreaming and kind of playing that game that John Gardner always talks about, creating that vivid and continuous dream. For me, in the writing process and the drafting, it's such an exciting time because anything can happen.
Yeah, it's such a, I can imagine you doing that kind of detective work. You've put down the artifacts you have gathered, and now you have to find the creases in between and see the connections. And I'm imagining a lot of that depends on intuition. And having lived with the artifacts for so long, and as you say, dreaming them, that's such an interesting and important way of going about creating those, because it's a kind of I wonder if you'd agree, it's an act of recreation that happens once you have taken those material too. I want to, Laurie also actually has a follow-up question, and I want to ask it to you. It's in 3 parts.
Okay.
What is it in a writer that really makes the connection in the writing to the reader? Is it empathy, identification, depth of immersion into the characters?
Ask it again.
Yeah. So Laurie wants to know, what is it in a writer that really makes that connection in the writing to the reader? Is it empathy, identification, depth of immersion into the characters?
Well, is it a cop-out to say all 3 of those things?
I don't think it's a cop-out at all.
I think it's all 3 of those things. I think that it's that empathy that you have for the character, that's a part of that groundwork of being observant and listening and seeing people and hearing them, not as you would hear them, but as they are, right? And then being able to somehow capture that and create it on the page with the specificity of detail, and being able to create that context for them by knowing, especially in this particular, in a couple of my in all 3 of the novels or the works that I'm thinking of, and even in Her Wild American Self, there is a certain amount of not just observation, but trying to relay someone who is not like me, who I don't understand, who is nothing like, in talking about identification, but there's something I recognize in an aunt or an uncle or a cousin or a community member or a teacher, and those things come together. So I think it's about the specificity of detail that comes after you've been observant, after you have been empathetic, after, I forget what the third one was, you can identify with those persons. Yeah.
Right. Laurie calls it depth of immersion.
Yeah.
And when you were talking, you described what drove your research is that an obsession with the characters. You had fallen in love with them, and you wanted to know, their atmosphere in order to really truly give credence to the lives they lived. Even though these are characters you're imagining.
They're my imaginary friends.
Imaginary friends.
Yeah.
I let me ask a few more questions. Isabella Torzan wants to know, I would like to ask, how can a writer organize the research information? Do you have files on each character and the environment? Do you write texts that won't be in the story just to help you write?
I use a number of different ways to organize my material. We're in my office right now. We're in my writing room, and it's as informal as stacks of books. There are stacks of books everywhere. I have notebooks, a number of notebooks, where I just try to organize and jot ideas down as I'm going. I do have files. I kind of have everything. And then I also, at some point, I have used note cards And I was once a script supervisor for film sets, did script and continuity. And there's a way that I have been able to actually organize things by giving them like scene number. I love organizing this stuff. So scene numbers and color coding, and then writing things as simple as like the purpose of a scene, where the scene happens, if it's past, present, future. So there are a number of ways that I'm like, that these organizing principles that I have outside of actually sitting down in front of the computer and writing are ways for me to think about the material, and are ways of getting me to actually engage in the material when I'm not in the mood to write, because sometimes we're not in the mood to write, right? But it is our writing time. So the organizing of these materials in multiple ways. I've got file folders and things like that. Like all kinds in baskets here, which you can't see, but it all becomes a way to engage in the material, even as I'm putting them together.
Yeah, that process you just described, the sort of creating an inventory and having to physically create it and continually sort of attend to it, I'm sure adds some level of density to the creation, to the writing itself. Since right. You know how language operates on that scale of, let's call it the metaphysical, right? You have to search for the words and so on. But you're touching material and organizing constantly, which I feel is linked to the creative process of writing as well. I have this one question, Evelina, because I have friends who are novelists and friends who, whenever their work is described as historical fiction, feel underserved by that title and do not like it, even though their work is often based in history. Right. Is this a rubric you're comfortable with, or
it's really funny because I think that really the truth is that all literature is in some way historical when we set it in a time and place. I mean, I think even if you were to look at speculative fiction, there you can see that that's also rooted in a time and place. And actually, my husband, who's a book critic, he and I kind of we debate about this, because just the other night we were walking and we were debating about this, because I have colleagues who write historical fiction, and they truly it's under that rubric of historical fiction, that definition, where I guess Chauncey was saying, and he could be right, he could be wrong, that historical fiction is really about when the fiction is happening at a time where no one from that period is living. I mean, I don't really know what the definition is, but I kind of think of the work that I do as historical in some ways, because, I'm constantly looking at, and by the way, it is October and it is Filipino American History Month. Yeah. So by the way, and for our community, that's such an important month, and it's such an important thing to look at our past, to see where we've come from, and then to know where we're going. And I think that that's, for me, a very important part of the fiction that I've written thus far. So much of what I'm looking at is rooted in the history of Filipino Americans, whether it's like in one tribe where it's really looking at the kind of the breadth of like when the Filipinos first came on the Acapulco, on the galleons, with the Spanish, to something as contemporary and maybe not as researched as the possibility of surviving comfort women living here in the United States, or having lived with us, among us in the United States, because that story is a story that was not really told in the Philippines until recently, and is one that we're just discovering here,
Okay. Yeah, so it historical fiction sounds then as a term to honor that history, and yeah. it can be, when we're writing in our contemporary moment, you're right that we are writing only in the aftermath of whatever has preceded us. So, in a sense, calling it a historical fiction, I can see how that helps to to honor that history. But nonetheless, it sometimes I can hear my friends say, no, but it's very fraught and limiting to promote something historical fiction.
Yeah, I think that is a very specific genre, and yet there is history in our fiction.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the final word on it, and it's brilliant. Let's see. There are more questions. Jose wants to know that Filipino ballad in your montage was beautiful. Can you share who performed this version? Thank you.
Yes, that was by the Harana Kings, and it is called O Ilao, and it is a traditional love song that oftentimes men who were serenading women would that song would be sung to them from the ground to the balconies, and it's a tradition in the Philippines to have, or it was back in the day. It doesn't happen anymore, I don't think, but they would, especially in the province where the story takes place in the country, hire singers and musicians, and then the man who is courting the woman would show up at her home, her parents' home, and sing to her a ballad. And so this is one of those ballads, and he's asking her to come to the window, and he's calling her light. It's a very beautiful song. So this is the Harana Kings who sang that version.
The Harana Kings. Thank you. Annalika Lynn Amog wants to know, and she says they say thank you so much for sharing that beautiful excerpt. What is it like for you as the writer when the different threads of history and memory begin to weave together into a narrative? I'll ask again. What is it like for you as the writer when the different threads of history and memory begin to weave together into a narrative?
So this is the time when I stop eating, I don't look at the clock, I don't pay attention to anything going around. I am completely absorbed in the novel, in the process of writing. It's exciting. It's the reason why I write, to engage and to also come up with challenges in the narrative and trying to figure out like what do I need to do to solve some of these challenges. For me, that it's all encompassing. So it's very exciting, and I love it. It's the reason I do it. Yeah. It's a challenge,
Yeah, it's a challenge you brilliantly hold together. I mean, for a reader, myself, who love your work dearly, it's thrilling for me just to hold what you have imagined in my hand. It's extraordinary to just someone spent all this time, and here it is. I can hold it in a compact form in my hand, and then live with the stories you're telling. So John Cape wants to know: do you outline your stories in advance? How much spontaneity goes into your writing process?
Right. So the first draft is oftentimes I just go for it and I just write. And I've got notes and notes and notes, lots of notes, and to remind myself of different elements I might want to touch on. But in the drafting, I just write. There is no outline. I kind of have a sense. Like sometimes I have a sense, like in Angel de la Luna and the Fifth Glorious Mystery, I knew what the ending was. I knew that I wanted this. I had this image of the main character standing over her mother and healing her. And it was this act of forgiveness. And I knew that she was very, very angry with her mom. So the question I had to ask myself throughout that story was, what would it take to get her to forgive her mom and to want to heal her in this way? So those first drafts oftentimes, and in this case, like in the case of Beautiful Sorrow, Beautiful Sky, which is still in progress, my big question is, does he get the girl? I mean, he sees her, he's absolutely captivated by her, and she's like free. She's a widow. She wants nothing to do with him, but he's a really charming guy. So the question, like kind of like the overall question is, does he get the girl? And that's what I work on with the first draft. And now that I've got like that first draft, I start to see what parts I actually have, what are working. There are many other subplots, and of course, the book, as I described, is much more than just does he get the girl? That's like what's going on top. But then that's when I start to think about things like, that's when I start to do that thing that I was talking about, where I actually go through as a script supervisor and I start to assign scene numbers, and I start to look at like the purpose of every scene. And then the outline comes after that. After I engage with the material, I see what's on the page, and then I start to play around with structure. So for me, like an outline for me, it's not for everyone, in the beginning would limit me in some ways. Mm-hmm. But when I start to see what the story is really supposed to be about, then I can apply an outline to really focus the narrative.
Mm-hmm. Is it too far-fetched to say, in a way, that the research is a form of outline? You're when you find different pieces of the research, you're starting to get a picture of what might come.
Yeah, you're starting to see what the possibilities are. Mm-hmm. And for me, starting to ask myself, well, what if I did this, or what if I did that, with the characters? I mean, it's really funny because I know that I had written a proposal for this book, and I think in it originally, Andres Angara knows her secret, and that's what it says in the proposal. But I've been working on the book, and then a friend of mine or one of my colleagues was reading a passage, and she said, I thought what's going on here? Because now, the way the book turned out, the book is turning out, he doesn't know. He doesn't know. And it's on the very last night that she that they're together, that she tells him. So so there are things that change as we move forward, as the story unfolds.
Right. We have a roughly around 2 minutes. And there's so many questions. Let me get at least two in. Cecilia wants to know, did you ever write a character that you didn't like, but was integral to your story? How did you deal with that in your writing process?
I think the characters that we don't like are probably the most interesting, oftentimes, right? I think, as I've been thinking about this, because as part of I actually took a year away from the University of Miami to write the book, and I was also a humanities fellow for the university, which is one way I got to take that year. And I had to present my work to my colleagues, and they really hated Dolores. I could just tell from the response that they were feeling like she was not as likable as Kenny, and for me, that unlikable nature in her, that kind of mean streak in her, is the reason for trying to understand who she is, and it gives her kind of that breath to grow within the novel, right? So that if the characters that we're writing are always likable, it could be a little saccharine and a little unreal and not as interesting. No place to go. You start out like a saint. Like where do you go from there?
Right. That's surprising, given what I gather about Dolores. She seems so complicated, and
she is complicated.
Yeah, a lot to like and not to like simultaneously.
But I thought it was an interesting comment on my colleague's part, because she's also surviving trauma. So what?
Raising how many children?
A baker's dozen, 13.
Baker's dozen. Oh wow, yeah. No, I'm fascinated and can't wait to see this book in the world, Evelina. Congrats on gathering these voices again. And
Can I say one thing?
yes, absolutely.
I have to correct you. I stepped down. I am no longer directing the creative writing program. By the way, congratulations to you. I want to say that my colleague Chantel Acevedo has taken on that role, and she's doing a magnificent job.
So we're not speaking director to director now? No?
No, we're speaking friend to friend, or Miami lover to Miami lover.
Yeah. There were other questions, Evelina, and maybe at a later point, possibly you'll find emails at your Miami, U of Miami email asking you. Sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions. But for those who have questions and those who don't, please purchase Evelina's books. Those are available to be purchased at the Buffalo Street Books. You can order online, or Books and Books in Miami, which you can also order online. But they are to be found wherever books are sold. Evelina, this has been truly a delight. Wish you were here in Ithaca. Today was a day to be envied. The beauty was astonishing.
Miss those waterfalls.
Yeah, you guys will be coming back whenever that's possible, and we will look forward to it.
When the germs are all gone.
Yes. Yes. So big thanks, Evelina, as always, and all the best to you. And see you soon again.
Yes, thanks to all of you. Thank you so much.